thanks to research and new discoveries, we're improving quality of care for people with cancers. And I can barely keep up with all the new late-breaking aspects as it relates to clinical research. We thought it appropriate to share with you all in our community clinical trials, and we thought of no one better to cover that than Dr. Kaklamani. And with her, just a warm welcome. Thank you so much, Virginia, for coming over.
Thank you.
And doing this.
Thanks, Dr. Wilkes. Thank you for being here. A couple of days ago, my girlfriend in Chicago texted me and says, "How are you doing? How's the weather?" So I looked outside. It was nice and sunny, and I remembered it was pretty pleasant when I had come to work. And I said, "Oh, it's beautiful. How's the snow?" Because it had snowed in Chicago a few days ago. And she said, "Oh, I've been hearing about all this weather in Texas, and I just wanted to make sure you're okay." And I said, "Oh no, we're good. Not in San Antonio." And then that night, the hail started. And then I realized exactly what she meant when she was asking me about how the weather was and all these poor cars getting destroyed by the hail. But it's really an honor and a pleasure for me to be here. And as Dr. Wilkes said, this is a topic that we're all very passionate about. And we're, you know, in our medical community, we're having a lot of discussions as to how to introduce a concept of clinical trials to patients relatives, to our community. And it never seems that there's the right time. We don't know whether we should be going to community centers and churches and places where, you know, people are just kind of bonding and just say, you know, let's talk to you about clinical trials. Because at that point, they probably won't care a lot, right? It's not personal to them because you're just kind of getting to them at a social event. And then when they initially get diagnosed with breast cancer or any kind of cancer, or a family member does, well, then it's not the right time either, because that's such an overwhelming time where they're learning everything there is to know about how they can get treated and get better. So introducing it at that point, again, becomes very stressful. And then introducing it while somebody is receiving treatment or has received treatment, in most cases, is a missed opportunity, because there may have been clinical trials that they could have participated in that we didn't talk about because it was an overwhelming period. So, you know, recognizing that this is something that there's never going to be a perfect time to discuss, what I think we've all concluded is that we just need to talk about it. And we just need to talk about it with everybody. And make sure that if there are any myths about clinical trials, we address those. Make sure that everybody understands what we mean when we talk about clinical trials, and getting educated the same way they get educated about a cancer diagnosis. So this is what I will share with you today. And please interrupt me, ask questions, or make comments. Let's see how this all goes. So, you know, we'll talk about today why we need clinical trials. Clinical trials, the word tends to be pretty scary. It means that you're exposing a patient to the unknown. And the patient already has the unknown of a cancer diagnosis. So then there's an even bigger unknown. But the reason why we do these trials is because we want to develop better treatments for our patients. We want to cure cancer. And the only way to cure cancer is to test our new drugs on cells and mice. And believe me, we've cured lots of mice. And, you know, baboons and chimpanzees and humans. And we start in the beginning by not even knowing what the dose of the drug is, to eventually finding out that a drug is so amazingly effective that it's curing more patients than were cured before. We also want to develop safe treatments. We don't want to just develop treatments, but safe treatments. So all these clinical trials that we do look at toxicities and very carefully address the toxicities of every single treatment that we have. And we also want to find markers of response. What does that mean? And we do clinical trials, and we take a patient who has cancer and we're giving them a drug, and we follow them because we do scans, or we somehow figure out how this drug is working. Well, the scans can take a few months for us to do, and in the meantime, the patient's cancer might be getting bigger, or getting smaller. And so by looking at specific markers on the cancer, we can individualize these treatments, and we can also figure out what the right patient is for that specific drug. So instead of exposing all cancer patients to one drug, we expose the patients that have a better chance of responding to that drug. And so again, we're helping those patients, and we're also helping the other patients not be exposed to a drug that may not work. So we have to do all of these things through our clinical trials, again, to try to improve the patient's life and quality of life. Now, how is a new drug developed? Well, that's where some brilliant scientist comes up with an idea. And it could be a scientist that works for a drug company. In most cases, it's actually a scientist in the community like us. And we have an idea and we start testing it out. And then we do a lot of laboratory studies, and we call those preclinical studies. So these are studies where a patient gets, the drug is being tested in cells and mice and a bunch of other animals. Those studies are where you're trying to figure out how well this drug works and what the mechanism is of this drug to work. Once we kind of figure that out, then we get brave enough where we can move on to studies in humans. And that becomes the tricky part. And places like this, places like the CTRC, like the START Center, have access to clinical trials where we call them first-in-human clinical trials. Those are trials where this drug has never been given to a human being before, and we're giving it to our patients. So those are the early trials where we have a lot of questions. But those are also the exciting trials, because those are the drugs that are very promising. Those are the drugs that we got to move them as quickly as we can, so that if they really work, they can help our patients sooner rather than later. And then eventually, the FDA looks at all the data that has been compiled and decides whether the drug should be approved for use as a standard of care drug. And that process is a very difficult process. So, we're all impatient, right? We all want to cure cancer tomorrow. Who doesn't? And when you look at these drugs and you look at all the news, there's articles in the news every single day about cancer and about how the scientists developed this thing and it's going to work and it's going to cure cancer. And then you're waiting a year and 2 years and 3 years and you don't hear anything more about it. And you're thinking, we're just kind of lazy. We're not doing what we're supposed to do. Well, this process takes somewhere around 15 to 20 years. From the time that somebody has a hypothesis to the time that the FDA approves a drug can take 20 years. The time that we actually have the drug and we're starting to test it in mice and humans, that process takes 10 years in of itself. So it's a process that we have to do very carefully, because obviously we have to make sure that something is safe and efficacious, safe for our patients, and at the same time gives them benefit. So to do this, we have different phases of clinical trials. And this is something that, if your physician gives you a consent form for a clinical trial, that consent form typically on the title tells you what the phase is that this clinical trial is. And it's very important to understand that, so that you know what this trial is about. What's this trial trying to do? So phase 0 is the beginning phase. It's the first type of study. The study where we're trying to figure out how this drug acts when we put it in our bodies. Where does it go? Does it go to the cancer? Does it go to other organs? How does it get out of our body? So we're trying to figure out the metabolism of the drug. And it's very important, because if a drug stays in our system for days and days and days, it might cause a lot more toxicity than if it only stays for a few hours. And even more importantly, if it never gets to the cancer, it's probably not going to work. So we need to look at all of these things so that we can figure out, is it worth it from this phase to move to the next one? And the next one is what we call a phase 1. And phase 1 is we're trying to find two things. What is the right dose of the drug? And how safe is it? What are the toxicities? What are the side effects that patients are getting on this drug? And so from that phase, again, we're trying to figure out whether it's worth proceeding to the next phase. The next phase is where we're trying to figure out how well this drug works. And we have a little bit of an indication when we give it to some patients, but typically a phase 1 study will have 9 patients, maybe 12 patients, so it's a small study. So it's pretty hard to figure out with 12 patients how well this drug is working. Then you need to expand it to more patients. So a phase 2 clinical trial might include 20, 30, 50, 100 patients or so. And there you're seeing really, is this drug really investing money and time into? So once you complete your phase 2 trial, if you get results, if you see that this drug is working better than you expected it to work, better than what you expected the standard of care drug to work, then you move to the phase 3 trial. And that's where you want to compare it to the standard of care. So those are the large trials. Those are trials that will include 500, 1,000, 2,000 patients. And that's where you're trying to figure out whether it's worth giving this drug to your patients compared to what's already available. So once you find out that this drug works better than your available option, then you go to the FDA and you say, listen, I've got this drug that's better than the drug that you approved previously. So I need you to approve it so my patients are going to benefit from it. And then after that, we got to monitor that drug. You've seen in the news many times where a drug has been out for a while and now all of a sudden thousands and thousands of patients are taking it, and then we find out that it's causing some kind of side effect that we didn't know because we hadn't tested it as much. Or, this drug is not as safe as we thought it was initially. And the company or the FDA calls the company and says, I don't like this drug anymore. Or we got to do some more work on this drug because some patients are getting the side effect that we hadn't kind of realized before. We hadn't realized how dangerous it was. So those are our post-marketing studies. So once a drug is approved, our job is not done. We have to monitor that drug even more to make sure that there's nothing else coming up that we hadn't figured out previously. So when a physician explains a clinical trial to you based on the phase of that clinical trial, you can kind of figure out what they're looking at. Are they looking at to see what the right dose of this drug is and how safe it is? Have they already figured it out and they're trying to figure out how well it works? Or is it really very close to approving this drug and you're trying to see whether it's better than what's already there? Now, as far as breast cancer, we're lucky because we have a lot of drugs available. But why do we have a lot of drugs available? Well, we have a lot of drugs available because our patients are brave enough that are letting us put them on clinical trials. So when we do clinical trials in breast cancer, we can do them with a lot of patients, and we can do a lot of clinical trials, and we can get results quickly. And that's why we have drugs in the past 15 years that we never had before. And when we look at how well our patients are doing, they're doing better than they ever did. And we're curing more breast cancers than we ever did. So in breast cancer, we have drugs that target a growth factor on the surface of the cancer cell that's called HER2. HER2 was discovered back in the 80s, and it was found that if the breast cancer cells have that little protein on them, they're very aggressive. They kind of spread very quickly. They don't respond as well to our standard treatments. So then they developed antibodies against that protein. And once they tested those antibodies, the results were amazing. I was at one of our national conferences a few years ago when a study was presented with one of those anti-HER2 drugs. And oncologists, we're kind of pretty boring. We kind of go to these conferences and we all kind of sit around and we listen. And when the results of that clinical trial were presented and we saw how impressive this drug was, everybody started clapping and yelling and screaming, and the presenter looked and said, "Oh my God, I feel like a rock star." This is how impressive it was. And again, it was impressive because we were able to do these trials and see how well these drugs work and how many patients they can cure. Other drugs that we have tested, and again were in the news, are drugs that look at how the blood vessels in the cancer are formed and whether we can block these blood vessels. You know, cancer has to eat too, right? And how does it eat? The cancer eats by forming blood vessels, and so then all the nutrients go in the cancer and make it grow. So the thought about these drugs was, if you're able to cut the blood supply to the cancer, cancer's going to die. And they actually, again, speaking of mice, they did lots of studies with these drugs in mice, and the results were amazing. These mice that are almost ready to die were cured of the cancer, and the cancer was nowhere to be found. In patients, these drugs didn't work as well. And we think that they didn't work as well because we didn't have a protein, we didn't have a marker to target. So kind of like the HER2 drugs, we had HER2. For the angiogenesis, we didn't have anything. So we were giving these drugs to every single breast cancer patient. So we're still kind of testing these drugs, and we're still hopefully going to find an answer, but right now we don't have that answer. And then the drugs that we use most commonly are drugs that target the estrogen receptor. So the receptor, so the protein on the breast cancer cells that feeds those cells by taking up the estrogen that our body produces. Now, you know, we call these targeted therapies brand new and so exciting, and sometimes we forget that in breast cancer, targeted therapies were developed in 1896 when a surgeon saw a woman and she had breast cancer, and he, for some reason, decided to take her ovaries out. And when he took her ovaries out, the breast cancer shrunk. So he kind of figured out, I'm doing something, but we didn't know anything about the estrogen receptor. We knew about estrogens, but that was pretty much it. And so that was the first targeted therapy that we had for breast cancer. And since then, we found the estrogen receptor, and we also found drugs that can latch onto that receptor and kill the cancer cells. And now we've moved even further from that. We have vaccines. And Dr. Wilkes has a couple of clinical trials that are looking at these vaccines and giving vaccines to our patients to try to prevent the cancer from coming back. We have immunotherapy. You know, you probably all heard President Carter, who had melanoma and received some drug, and now nobody can find the melanoma. And he had melanoma in his brain, he had in his liver, and the drug that he received was a drug that empowered his immune system to kill the cancer. So totally different approach, right? We're used to giving chemotherapy. What does chemotherapy do? It kills every fast-growing cell there is, including our own. So we lose our hair, we feel sick, we get weak. These drugs do the exact opposite. They strengthen our body. They strengthen our immune system so that that immune system can attack the cancer. And in diseases like melanoma, kidney cancer, lung cancer, these drugs have revolutionized therapy. And we're now testing them in breast cancer, and again, we're finding pretty good and interesting results. I had a dear patient of mine who came with a very difficult to treat breast cancer, and her oncologist in one of the nearby towns had said, I have nothing else to offer you. I'm giving you chemotherapy and the cancer's growing, and I don't have anything else to give you. And this poor woman couldn't complete a sentence without coughing. She couldn't sleep at night because she was coughing. Her husband couldn't sleep at night because she was coughing. So I said, well, you know, we have this trial with an immunotherapy drug. Let's try it, because it doesn't seem like our chemotherapy is working. So if I give you more chemotherapy, it's not going to do anything. Let's try something outside the box. Let's see how that goes. That was in July. A month after she received the drug, her cough had pretty much almost gone away. 2 months later, totally asymptomatic. She couldn't even tell she had cancer. And when we looked at her scans, we couldn't find the cancer. It's now March, April. She's still on this clinical trial doing well. And these are things that 2 years ago, we didn't have available for our patients. So these are all the advances that we're making that are really wonderful, and we couldn't be making them unless our patients were educated enough to participate on these clinical trials. And then obviously we have combination therapies where we're trying to kind of combine 2 or 3 of those treatments together to get even more benefit for our patients. Now, there's a few misconceptions about clinical trials. There's obviously a lot of fear. It's the fear of the unknown. So what are the facts? The facts are that all clinical trials are voluntary. Nobody can or should force you to participate on a clinical trial. And if you read the consent form that they're going to give you, in that consent form it says your participation is voluntary. You can decide. Dr. Wilkes, myself, any other physician are never going to treat you differently because you decide or because you don't decide to participate on a clinical trial. You're still our patient. You're still the same person that we met before we talked about clinical trials. Besides studying treatments, some of the trials are looking at new ways to detect or diagnose cancer or diagnose or figure out the extent of the disease. So we don't only have treatment trials. We don't only have trials that test drug A or compare drug A to drug B. We have trials where we're trying to learn more about the disease. We have trials where we're looking at those biomarkers to again see what biomarkers are important for future development. And then, this is the third one we also, and then we also have surgery trials. And those are in radiation trials, and those are even more tricky, where we have patients and we take 2 groups, and one group has surgery and the other group doesn't. Or one group has surgery and the other group has radiation. And we do those trials because we're trying to move to less invasive treatments. We're trying to see, can we do radiation instead of surgery? Are there some patients that we don't need to do any surgery on? And there's going to be these trials that are going to be coming out in the next few years where we're going to give our treatment to patients. And if patients' tumor responds really well and we can't see it anymore, we may not do surgery on them. We may just leave the tumor in and see if it's ever going to grow back. And those, imagine how hard it's going to be for our patients to go on these trials, right? They're going to say, but I had this cancer. You're never going to do surgery. You're never going to take it out. But at the same time, I see my patients who I treat with these treatments and the cancer melts away. They always ask me, so why do I need surgery? I thought my cancer went away. Why do I need surgery? So we have to do these trials to find out what the right treatment is. Not more, not less. Now, how do you figure out if this is the right trial for you? And this is where we kind of look at exactly what type of trial this is. Do we look at treatment trials? Do we look at prevention trials, trying to prevent cancer? Do we look at screening trials? Again, it's been in the news for how long? Are mammograms good enough to help screen for breast cancer? And then quality of life trials. How am I affecting my patients' activity of daily living, my patients' well-being by exposing them on this drug? How can I help with the symptoms? So there I may not be treating them to find a better treatment, but I might be trying to find a better treatment for the symptoms of the treatment that the patient is on for their cancer. Very important trials as well. Now the good news is that, and this is for everything, not just clinical trials, you as patients need to be your own best advocate. And just because you go to a doctor's office and you ask questions doesn't mean that that's all there is. There's a lot of websites that have information about anything, but there's also websites that have information about clinical trials. And probably the most comprehensive website is the one from the National Cancer Institute, that is the clinicaltrials.gov. And that's where every single clinical trial that we do has to be on that database. Otherwise, we can't do that trial. And so if you are wondering, am I eligible for a clinical trial? You can go onto that website and you can type kind of simple little things. You can type colon cancer or breast cancer and what stage of cancer you have, and are you looking to do, are you looking for a trial that is a prevention trial or a treatment trial? And then it'll give you a list of what trials are available all over the country. And you can actually even put your zip code and say, I want to look for a trial within, 50 miles or 100 miles, something that you think you can drive to. And it again gives you the trials that are available. And then you take that piece of paper and you go to your doctor and say, this is what I found, what do you think? Are any of those trials piquing your curiosity? Do you think that I should be considering some of those trials? Now, again, a physician presents a clinical trial to their patient, and obviously this is an overwhelming visit because you've talked about a lot of things, and all of a sudden they give you a 25-page consent form, and now you have to read it and decide what you're going to do. So there's a lot of questions that you may want to be thinking about, and you may want to be asking your physician. Some of these questions, the answers are in the consent form itself. But some of them you may need your physician to answer. So for example, who's doing this clinical trial? Who's the sponsor? Is it a pharmaceutical company? Is it the National Cancer Institute? Is it one of our large cooperative groups? Or is it the physician who's talking to you? All of those things might change your decision as to whether to participate or not, or more importantly, may help you understand what this clinical trial is. What is the phase? Is it a phase 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 clinical trial? And that again gives you an idea of where is this drug? Is this drug just kind of starting out, or have we figured out a lot of things and now we're just at the final phase? Where is it being done? Is this place the only place that has this trial, or are we doing this trial in the whole country or the whole world? Why do I want to participate in this clinical trial? What's in it for me? What might the benefits be? What might be the drawbacks by participating in this clinical trial? And with all of these things, you can kind of figure out what to expect. What are the goals? Is the goal of this clinical trial to cure me? Or is the goal of this clinical trial to prolong, to delay the progression of my cancer? Or is the goal of that trial to just look at my symptoms and see how well I'm doing and whether I can do any better? As you can see, a long list of questions, right? And actually those questions are also on the NCI website. So when you go to the NCI website, it'll help educate you about clinical trials, but it'll also kind of help you ask the right questions. And so you may want to take those questions with you, or at least the important ones. You may not want to be asking your doctor all of these questions in one meeting. It might be a little overwhelming for everybody. But at least it'll give you an idea and help familiarize you with the clinical trials and the clinical trial process. So a big one is placebo, right? I've got cancer, and you're telling me you're going to give me a sugar pill? How is that ever possible? Well, the good news is, for our cancer trials, it's extremely rare that we will only give you a sugar pill. We got to treat your cancer, right? So we may be giving you a treatment that's a standard treatment, and then we're trying to figure out if another pill might help the standard treatment work better. And so the only way to do this is we divide our patients into two groups, and we give the one group the standard treatment plus a sugar pill, and the other group the standard treatment plus the other drug. But the important thing to keep in mind there is that every single patient is getting the standard treatment. So nobody is only getting placebo. But that's very important for you to understand, for you to know, and for you to ask for your physician. What does randomization mean? That's when a computer gets to decide what treatment arm you're on. Your doctor doesn't get to decide. You don't get to decide. Computer doesn't know you, doesn't know what you look like. They just know where you're from, what the center is, what kind of cancer you have, and then based on pretty specific criteria, the computer decides whether you're going to be on this treatment arm or that treatment arm. And that's something that we have to accept as patients and physicians, that we are not in control of what treatment we're going to get. What kinds of treatments and tests am I going to have when I participate on this clinical trial? Clinical trials can be time-consuming, and we all are very busy these days. So when I expect my patient to come every day for a week, that might be pretty tough on them. If I expect my patient to have an extra biopsy, because that's part of that clinical trial, then I expose them to a risk that I otherwise would not be exposing them to. So that's very tough on them. They have to understand it. They have to be able to agree to it. So those are things that you are going to be in the consent form, but you may want to be asking because they might generate more questions or help you decide whether you should be doing this clinical trial or not. Now, why do we all do clinical trials? We all do clinical trials because we want to learn. And we do them at the CTRC, we do them at Texas Oncology, we do them at START. We're lucky in San Antonio. We have many centers that have many clinical trials. And each center has their own little subspecialty. The clinical trials that we do are clinical trials that we have from pharmaceutical companies, clinical trials that we have from large cooperative groups, clinical trials that we have from the National Cancer Institute, and also clinical trials that we have from the research that we have done at the university. And the good news is that if you're a patient at the CTRC, but Texas Oncology has a clinical trial that I think is the right trial for my patient, it's a phone call away. I call Dr. Wilkes and I say, can you please see this patient because I think they might be a good candidate for that clinical trial. And I do this all the time. The same way she does the exact opposite. She'll call me and say, hey, I have this patient and I'm looking for a specific clinical trial. Do you have something like that? And if I do, I see that patient. And that's the only way we're all going to learn, and that's the only way we're all going to help our patients. What's amazing is the fact that it's been shown that patients that participate in clinical trials live longer. That's something that you can't say for a lot of treatments that we offer. So even though there's all these unknowns about our clinical trials, our studies have shown that they benefit, even if that specific trial may not necessarily benefit that specific patient. Overall, the majority of patients that are going to be on clinical trials are going to live longer because they were on those clinical trials. And obviously, all those clinical trials are going to help the next generation of patients. The same way the trials done 20 years ago are helping us today. So that's the whole benefit of trying to be on a clinical trial, and even though it might be a tough decision, and even though there might be even more unknowns than the treatment that is considered our standard treatment. And now, kind of my last message, we will never find a cure unless we do clinical trials. And I hope that I was able to educate you about what these trials are, and hopefully when somebody presents a trial to you, it's not as big of an unknown as it may have been before this talk. So I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you for coming. I know it's in the middle of the day, so I truly appreciate that.
Do you guys have any questions? Well, one of the things I guess I wanted to ask, do you guys understand why we do randomization? Why is that necessary?
It takes the bias out of the situation.
Because sometimes people come to us, look at me and Dr. Kakamai and say, why can't you just choose my treatment? And we see that sort of set up in the phase 2 and definitely in the phase 3 that Dr. Kakamai presented. But sometimes just because we have we don't realize that by being aware that we think that a certain treatment may or may not be beneficial, we're influencing the results. So by taking the same population with the same features or aspects in terms of how they're presenting with their stage of disease, and then having a computer select your treatment eliminates the bias. I had to present this, and Dr. Kakamani has a lot of research studies there at the CTRC, of course, with the NCI designation and such. But, you know, to sit there and tell a person, I'm blinded, I don't know, my staff does not know, we won't know which treatment you are on, is a real challenge. But the reason that we have to do that is we recognize that if we don't do that, I mean, and I have seen that, where I'm convinced that a treatment is the best treatment, and that I'm humbled at many of the meetings that we attend, that she speaks at, that we have discovered that we thought something was really beneficial, and then when it was randomly assigned with the same population of folks with the same risk categories, that the treatment was not effective. In fact, it might have been hazardous. It may have been ineffective. Everybody wants the President Carter's drug, right? But we have to do studies in order to verify that those results are not by chance. It's very hard to not believe that a treatment that he got that makes all the cancer disappear, that's not good. But actually, we are now doing phase 3 trials with that to verify that in certain types of cancers that can be confirmed. The last thing we want to do is have people get treatment that is not effective or that may have some safety issues. So the randomization is actually a requirement. It's hard for those who are patients and survivors to have that as a choice, but it's hard sometimes for us physicians too, because we have a sort of an updated aspect of what the treatment is looking like and all the promising, and we're real excited. We go in the room and say, okay, I've got something great for you. We are humbled sometimes that what we initially think is effective is not. So randomization equalizes that and reduces the question in terms of the value of that treatment. That type of process, though, can take years. And so she mentioned, and I think everyone was probably stunned to know how long it takes from the first time a drug is started to be looked at, that it's almost 15 to 20 years, and we got to do something about that. I'd ask you about, can you comment about some of the preoperative trials and that PCR, and maybe give them some ideas of how we speed up that timeline, Dr. Kaufman?
Yeah, that's a great topic, and that's where advocates are so important, because they help guide us and guide the FDA. So again, I'll use breast cancer as the example. We try to cure our breast cancer patients, and the majority of our breast cancer patients are cured, which is wonderful. But while we're trying to do this and we're trying to develop new drugs, the way we try to see if a new drug works is we give it in somebody who has early stage curable breast cancer that we've taken out by surgery. So as far as we know, there's no breast cancer left in their body. And then we're giving them a drug, and then that's the waiting game. Waiting 3 months, and 6 months, and a year, and 2 years, and 5 years, and 10 years to see if that cancer is going to come back. Well, those studies take 3 months, and 6 years, and 10 years to come out, right? And the majority of them in breast cancer will take at least 5 years. And to be able to get these results, we also have to subject thousands of patients to that clinical trial. So when we, as a community and our pharmaceutical colleagues, were coming up with all these new drugs that were extremely exciting, and then we kind of had to wait and wait and wait and wait, that became very frustrating, and not just for us, but more importantly for our patients. So our advocates said, we can't have this. You got to figure out a better way and a faster way to get these drugs to our patients if they're really efficacious. So now what we do is we give these drugs before a patient has surgery. So we have a breast cancer, we know how big it is, we've done mammograms and ultrasounds, and now we're giving a drug. And we're treating that patient for 3 months or 6 months with that drug. And then we do surgery. And at the time of surgery, we can see how much of that breast cancer was killed by our drug. And so instead of waiting years to get that result, we wait 6 months and we have that result in 6 months. And by the pressure that the FDA received from our advocates and from the physicians, it accepted those types of trials as an avenue to approve drugs quicker. At the same time, we all recognize that even though now these drugs are available for our patients, we still need to continue to do studies, and we still need to continue to do our long studies. And so those are ongoing, and once we get our final results, then the FDA is going to look at them again and decide whether this drug is really worth continuing to provide to our patients. So that's a nice, easy way to do clinical trials that are not as expensive, that don't require as many patients to participate, and more importantly, that we're going to get our results much quicker than otherwise. You know, Dr. Wilkes talked about the randomization. My example in mind had been, I don't know if you guys remember, in the mid-90s, everybody that had breast cancer wanted to get a transplant. Transplant was going to cure breast cancer. And the reason this actually came out is very unfortunate. There was a researcher in South Africa that did a study on some patients there and found amazing results. You basically give so much chemotherapy to this patient that you wipe out their bone marrow, and then you're giving that bone marrow back to them, and you're curing their cancer. Well, if you give them that much chemotherapy, you can imagine the patient has a lot of toxicities, right? So after those results, every single patient, every single physician, and every single advocacy group said that we should be transplanting every patient with breast cancer. So a lot of people started doing it. And then insurance companies started saying, hey, hold on. I'm paying for this transplant. It's pretty expensive. So how can you guys really tell me that it works? And so then we started doing clinical trials. But it was so hard to put these patients on clinical trials because we all knew the answer. Bone marrow transplant worked, cured a lot of patients. Yeah, you know, kind of made them sick for a while, but we cured them, and that was the important thing. Well, then we found out that the physician in South Africa manipulated his data, and his data wasn't right. He did that on purpose. And then we found out that all these large clinical trials that we did here, where half of our patients had the transplant, the other half had the treatment that we were considering standard, did exactly the same. But those transplant patients had a pretty bad quality of life because we were giving them a lot of toxicities from our chemotherapy drugs to expose them to be able to do the transplant afterwards. So that was a lesson learned. That was something that humbled us, that even if we've decided that we know what's going on, sometimes we're wrong. And we better do these trials to prove to ourselves whether we're right or wrong.
Other questions or comments?
I think one of the things that would be nice to talk about is the fact that you are a National Cancer Institute designation and how that influences your ability to do clinical trials and brings the money into your institution. So
the designation of the National Cancer Institute means that we, as a cancer center, have the responsibility to do different type of research. We have to do our preclinical research, we have to do some drug discovery, we have to do our clinical trials, and we have to enroll a pretty large number of our patients on clinical trials. A big part of it also is that we are responsible for our region, and our region is actually all of South Texas. You know, as you all know, and as I'm learning more and more since I've moved here, when you go south of San Antonio, you start getting into places where there aren't that many resources for our patients, and our patients don't have insurance. Some of those patients are not even legally in the country, but once they're in the country, we have to take care of them. And so one of the things that we actually do a lot is go to those areas and help those areas with resources that otherwise they wouldn't have available. And again, that's part of why we receive the money from the National Cancer Institute, to be able to serve this large South Texas community.
That's great. Anyone else?
What is the status of getting volunteers for clinical trials? Is it difficult, or Or do you even know?
Can you repeat the question? So the question was, what is the status of getting volunteers for clinical trials? So when you're talking about volunteers, do you mean the patients that are going to be on those clinical trials? So it's hard, and it's everybody's fault. It's our fault, it's our patient's fault, it's the community's fault. And ultimately, it's our fault because we should be educating our patients and we should be educating our community. So we, just to give you an example, nationally, around 2% of our cancer patients go on clinical trials. 2%. How are we going to learn? And even worse, the majority of the patients that are on these clinical trials are Caucasian, are white. So when we start talking about cancers in African Americans, cancers in Hispanics, we have no idea, because there's around 10% of the patients on clinical trials are African American, and around 5% are Hispanic. Well, in San Antonio, around 60% of our population is Hispanic, right? And so that's another thing that the NCI has tasked us to do. So at the CTRC, around 50% of our clinical trial accruals are Hispanic. Obviously, we see more Hispanic patients than are seen in Chicago. But that's the only way that we're going to learn. So when, the issues that I encounter, and I'm sure Dr. Wilkes as well, when I talk to my patients about clinical trials, is, first of all, suspicion. Why are you telling me about this? What do you have to gain? Second one is fear. I'm going to be on something that we don't know a lot of information about. It may cause more symptoms, more side effects. Third is the time commitment. Not only for the patients, but for us too. For me to talk about a clinical trial to a patient, it'll take me at least half an hour just in one visit, and then there's going to be more visits, then there's going to be extra work for me to be able to document everything, and my staff. So all of the people that are responsible for continuing those clinical trials, I mean, we have a clinical trials office that employs around 30 or so people. Their only job is to help me do my clinical trials. So it's very hard, and that 2% needs to increase. So we are told by the National Cancer Institute that we have to increase that 2% to 15%. And at the CTRC, we're not at 2%, we're around 10%. But we got to get to 15%. And that's hard.
Jackie, what's the criteria? Newly diagnosed or experiencing
Everything.
metastasis, or anybody?
So depending on the on the stage of a patient's cancer, there's clinical trials that patient might be eligible for. And so there are some clinical trials that look at, like I said, people that don't even have cancer, trying to prevent cancer. How wonderful would that be? We don't have to deal with cancer anymore. There's clinical trials that look at patients that were just diagnosed with cancer. And then clinical trials for patients that have cancer that has come back and has spread to other parts, and now we're trying to find ways to help them live longer and better, and hopefully cure them as well. So depending on what kind of, what stage the cancer is and what kind of clinical trial it is, different patients can go on. So at any point, you can ask your physician about a clinical trial. You can go in for a regular visit and say, hey, you know what, I had this talk, and people are talking about clinical trials, and do you think there's any trial that I might be eligible for? And then you can start that conversation.
I'll go ahead,
Does race or nationality make any difference?
So the question was whether race or nationality makes any difference.
One example I always like to give, when we use the word Hispanic, if you were born and raised in Spain, most people, those Spaniards, do not consider themselves Hispanic. Hispanic is only in the New World. So does that make any difference in all these studies of somebody's race or ethnicity?
So, and the question was whether the race of ethnicity of somebody makes a difference. And what we've recognized is that genetically we're a little different. So whites, not Hispanics, are a little different from Hispanics, a little different from blacks. And even blacks, there's African Americans, there are Caribbean. So all of those subpopulations are a little different in how genetically they are formed. And those genetics can change the kind of cancer they get, and in breast cancer, even the kind of breast cancer that they get. It can change how they metabolize the drugs. So we have actually seen that certain populations seem to get more toxicities from our drugs than others. And we have the benefit again in San Antonio of having a lot of Hispanics, and so we're actually looking, because we've found that in many of our Hispanic patients, those patients don't tolerate those chemotherapy drugs as well as non-Hispanics. So we're actually looking to see what's happening. Is there a specific reason where the chemotherapy stays in their system longer and exposes them to more toxicity, so that we can understand it and so we can better treat them? And again, is there any other treatment that might work better than others? So it is very important in our clinical trials that we include individuals from every race, every ethnicity, so that we can understand this trial better. Because if I do a clinical trial and I only include white women from some region, and then I have a Hispanic woman, and she says, how is this drug going to work on me? I don't know. I never tested somebody like you because I just didn't. So, and we have, the National Cancer Institute has this large database of tissue. Our patients have volunteered their tumors, and on that database, 98% of those samples are from white people. 0.3% is from Hispanics. How are we going to learn? So very important. And again, our responsibility as physicians to look at that and be able to offer these trials to everybody, regardless of what race or ethnicity they're in. If somebody comes, again, in San Antonio, we have a lot of Hispanics that are only Spanish speaking. Well, I don't speak Spanish very well, or at all. So for me, to explain a clinical trial to them, I need to have a translator. So instead of this process taking half an hour, it takes an hour. So if I have a very busy clinic, I'm going to look at my schedule and say, geez, can I do this today? And if my answer is no, then I'm compromising the data that's being collected. And I'm not allowing a patient who otherwise might want to participate in a clinical trial.
What's the financial angle for patients?
So the question was what the financial angle is, and that's again, extremely important. So, and that's again written in the consent form, so you want to make sure. In most cases, the clinical trial, whatever is considered research, is covered by the trial. So if the trial is a pharmaceutical trial, then the pharmaceutical company pays for anything that's considered research. If it's a trial from the National Cancer Institute or the university, then it's covered by that entity. Whatever is considered standard of care, something that a patient would get anyway, then the patient's insurance gets billed for it. So a patient should not have to pay anything extra by participating on that clinical trial. Now, interestingly, there's very few plans, I don't know if you encountered that in them they say the patient cannot participate in a clinical trial.
Not recently.
Not recently.
But I've had situations where the patient went on a randomized study and they got assigned to standard of care, and because they were on a clinical trial, their insurance would not allow them to do that. But most of those kinds of things, because of laws, have improved things. And of course, when you go to a center like where Dr. Kakamani works, it's a little bit easier, but those constraints still remain. I know the hour's getting towards 1 o'clock, and I want to make sure that if anyone has to scoot to allow for a sort of a transient break, but if you have more questions, are you going to be available for a little bit?
Sure.
To talk? And then we have a couple things you want to I guess there's a raffle that we do, but I don't want to stop the moment, but I know there's a couple folks who are going to be going.
Did everyone get a raffle ticket when you walked in? If you didn't, raise your hand. We can bring one over.
Also, please, If it's not eating,
Please,
please.
I want to give a round of applause for not only for her time and
Her commitment to someone as special as she, but also just for her knowledge and what a great asset we have in her. Really, I think one of the things that she presents and one of the things that's just really neat because what we do is that we have a really neat opportunity for collaboration in this town to really try to provide some very special things. And if there's one message to take away, though there's many centers which offer special and unique opportunities, San Antonio has a lot to offer. And we really should look at our own neighborhood, our own, place where we dwell to look for those opportunities. I think that that's a big secret, and we really want to blow that out of the water. We really want you all, you've heard a lot today that you might internalize for yourselves, but if you had the opportunity where a friend or neighbor or someone that's related to you needs an option for, a new treatment or possible hope for another therapy, think about San Antonio before you maybe hasten away. We really do want you all to help spread that word. But thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Very much.
And would you